Okay, let's get right into it. We are looking at a really pivotal moment for Europe and NATO. You could argue it's the biggest discussion around defense spending, readiness since the Cold War. There's this powerful, really urgent push happening. But what's actually driving it? What are the concrete plans? And I guess the big question, will it be enough? And crucially, fast enough, given the scale of the challenge. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a stack of sources. You've shared recent articles, some research laying out this, complex picture. Our mission is really to cut through the noise, pull out the key insights, and help you understand what's really going on with boosting NATO's collective defense, especially with rising threats and, these big shifts in global dynamics. And I'm really looking forward to unpacking this material with our expert guide. So let's jump straight into the why. Reading through these sources, there's one driver for this intense focus on defense that really stands out. What's the primary concern that comes through loudest?
Yeah, what's truly striking, and it's very clear in the sources, is the assessment of Russia's military reconstitution. Even with the heavy losses in Ukraine, and the sources estimate staggering casualties, maybe up to 790,000 dead and wounded. The analysis isn't that Russia's collapsing, not at all. Quite the opposite, actually. The sources highlight Russia rebuilding, adapting its forces faster than many anticipated. And that poses a formidable and potentially imminent threat in the near to medium term.
Faster than anticipated. That seems a bit counterintuitive given everything we hear about the fighting in Ukraine. How are the sources measuring that speed? What specifics do they give?
Oh, they get quite granular. General Cavoli's testimony, which pops up in some of the material, is pretty stark. He points out the Russian army isn't just reconstituting, it's actually larger numerically now than before the full-scale invasion started.
Larger, despite the losses.
Yes. And it's not just troop numbers, it's about industrial output. The sources give some, frankly, alarming estimates for Russian defense production just this year. We're talking figures like 1,500 new tanks.
Wow.
3,300 armored vehicles, and around 200 Iskander ballistic missiles.
1,500 tanks in a year. That's a serious number by any standard.
It is. But maybe the most critical detail, the one that really shows the scale of their industrial ramp-up, is artillery shells. The sources estimate Russia is on track to produce something like 250,000 artillery shells per month.
Per month.
Per month. Think about that. That figure, according to these sources, is roughly 3 times the combined monthly production capacity of the U.S. and Europe right now.
3 times? Okay, that really puts the gap into perspective. That's immense.
It is. Deeply concerning conventional firepower gap.
And the sources also make it clear Russia's preparations aren't just about Ukraine. They mention infrastructure, military buildups closer to NATO's eastern flank.
Absolutely. The material details significant military infrastructure expansion, particularly near Finland's border and facing the Baltics. There's talk of expanded garrisons, training areas. One specific example they highlight is the Leningrad military district. Sources indicate brigade sizes there are effectively being tripled, new units forming, old ones reactivated. This isn't just Ukraine fighting. It strongly suggests Russia is posturing, preparing for potential long-term confrontation, specifically with NATO.
And this buildup leads to a pretty unsettling timeline mentioned in the sources, doesn't it?
It does. Based on the speed of reconstitution, this buildup, the sources present a concerning time frame. They estimate Russia could potentially be ready, sufficiently ready, to pose a significant conventional threat to NATO territory in, maybe as little as 2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years.
Some estimates stretch it out to maybe 5 years, but even 5 years is a very narrow window. This projected timeline is what's injecting such urgency into these defense discussions in Europe.
Okay, so the primary driver, a faster than expected, pretty comprehensive Russian military buildup. But the sources also point to another major factor influencing Europe's thinking, something happening across the Atlantic.
Right, that comes up repeatedly. The sources link Europe's increased defense urgency to concerns about the future reliability, the focus of the United States. There's a clear anxiety, maybe amplified by statements related to former President Trump and the possibility of his return, that the U.S. security guarantee might become, conditional, or that U.S. military focus could just shift decisively towards the Indo-Pacific, towards China.
And the sources seem to suggest this potential shift means Europe really can't just rely on the U.S. to carry the main conventional defense load against Russia anymore like it has for decades.
Exactly. It highlights the absolute necessity for European nations to dramatically increase their own capabilities, their self-reliance. The sources argue Europe must be able to deter and, if it comes to it, defend itself effectively against Russia. Even in a scenario where full-scale U.S. support might not be immediate or, reliable at the scale it once was, it's presented as a harsh wake-up call in the material. Europe needs to step up, carry significantly more of the load within the alliance.
Which brings us to Europe's starting point, which the sources describe as, well, less than ideal after years of underinvestment.
That's a key challenge they highlight. Decades of focusing maybe on expeditionary stuff or assuming big state-on-state war was history. It left many European militaries, and crucially their defense industries, significantly degraded, ill-equipped for sustained high-intensity conventional war like we're seeing in Ukraine. Stockpiles are low, equipment readiness is iffy, industrial capacity just sort of withered.
And the current spending levels reflect that history, right?
Yeah.
Even with the recent increases.
They do. I mean, there's been progress towards that existing 2% of GDP NATO target. The sources note 18 out of 32 members now meet or exceed it. But the combined defense budgets of European NATO members, plus Canada, are still just hovering over 2% of their total GDP. And the sources are clear. Given the renewed Russian threat, the U.S. uncertainty, that 2% target, it's not enough anymore. It's the baseline, not the goal.
Okay. So against this backdrop, reconstituting Russia, potential U.S. shift, underinvestment, what are the ambitious new targets being discussed in the sources to try and close this gap?
Right. This is where the numbers get really big. The most prominent new target being floated, and it's discussed by NATO Secretary General Rutte in the sources, is a push for European NATO members to allocate 5% of their total economic output, their GDP, to defense.
5%? Wow, that is a massive jump from the current 2% target.
It is huge. And the sources explain how that 5% breaks down. It's seen as 3.5% for traditional military spending, tanks, planes, soldiers, training, and then an additional 1.5% dedicated to what they call defense-related expenditure.
Okay, what does that cover?
That part's crucial. It includes investing in civilian infrastructure that's absolutely vital for moving forces in a crisis. Things like upgrading roads, railways, bridges, ports, airfields to handle heavy military equipment. It's recognizing defense isn't just the military, it's the nation's physical ability to support it.
And the sources explicitly connect this 5% target to addressing those political concerns about future U.S. commitment, almost like a direct response.
They do. The material doesn't really mince words there. This ambitious target is being pushed partly to show the U.S., maybe figures like Donald Trump specifically, that Europe is serious. Serious about carrying its weight, taking responsibility for its own security. It's a political signal as much as a military need. Trying to preempt arguments that Europe isn't doing enough.
Are countries actually signing up for this?
Well, several nations are signaling intent or already putting plans in place. Poland is aiming for 5%, maybe as early as 2025. Germany, maybe surprisingly, has voiced support for a 5% target in principle. France is targeting 3.5%. The UK looking at 2.5% by 2027, aiming for 3% eventually. And the EU itself is also stepping up, planning a €150 billion push for defense investment, making it easier for countries to exceed budget limits for defense spending using emergency clauses.
Okay, so the money might be there, the targets are much higher, but what does this actually mean in terms of real military power? What specific capabilities do the sources say need this huge cash injection to effectively deter Russia?
The sources detail several critical areas where a quantum leap is needed, that's Rutten's phrase, to make NATO stronger, fairer, and more lethal, able to meet that threat timeline.
Okay, let's run through some of those. What's top of the list?
A major priority highlighted is a massive, frankly unprecedented 400% increase in air and missile defenses.
400%.
Yeah. The sources link this directly to countering Russia's tactic in Ukraine, using massed missile and drone strikes to terrorize people, disrupt infrastructure. This needs more interceptors, yes, but also more launchers, radars, integrated command control across the whole alliance. Beyond that, they call for big increases in heavy conventional stuff, thousands more armored vehicles, tanks, IFVs, and crucially, millions more artillery shells and other ammo types to sustain a fight against a large force.
I noticed the sources also put a huge emphasis on unmanned systems. That feels very much like learning lessons from Ukraine and elsewhere.
Absolutely. There's a call for a massive buildup of unmanned vehicles, both aerial drones and maritime ones. The sources point to the undeniable impact of drones in Ukraine, from little recon quads to bigger strike platforms, their effectiveness, their relative affordability. They also mention things like the U.S. Navy's Task Force 59, the Southern Spear efforts in the Middle East, showing the potential for integrating lots of unmanned sea drones for surveillance, interdiction. NATO has done some things, like Baltic Sentry with drones, but the scale needed for a real conflict scenario, according to sources, is just exponentially larger. It's not just buying drones, it's the infrastructure, training doctrine to use them en masse.
What about traditional forces, boots on the ground, especially on that eastern flank near Russia?
The sources are pretty blunt there. They say there are currently too few forces permanently stationed, readily available right on the borders with or near Russia. To meet NATO's new force model, which requires specific troop numbers at different readiness levels, deployable fast immediate steps are needed. This includes boosting forward presence, setting up physical obstacles. The material even mentions potentially extensive minefields, specifically anti-vehicle mines.
Mines? That's controversial.
Yes, they know the distinction from anti-personnel mines banned by the Ottawa Treaty and acknowledge some nations might need to withdraw from relevant treaties for this anti-vehicle capability. It also means permanently moving significant forces east, like Germany's plan for a full brigade in Lithuania by 2027, and pre-positioning gear closer to the front lines.
So troops can fly in and fight faster?
Exactly. Link up with their equipment quickly.
Cyber defense and critical infrastructure resilience also feature heavily. Why is that seen as such a core military capability?
Because modern warfare, as the sources stress, isn't just kinetic. It's deeply reliant on civilian systems. NATO military ops depend totally on civilian infrastructure. Power grids for bases, transport networks for troop movement, comms lines for command. The sources highlight Europe's significant vulnerability to cyber attacks and Russia's sophisticated integrated cyber warfare capabilities.
So it's not just about military networks.
Not at all. Enhancing resilience isn't just buying cyber defenses. It needs deep, effective collaboration. NATO, the EU, and crucially, the private sector that owns and runs most of this infrastructure. It means identifying critical assets, better threat information sharing, setting up structured coordination, maybe like sector-specific councils, to ensure these vital networks can hold up under attack and support military operations.
And finally, underpinning all this is the defense industrial base itself. The sources seem to portray this as maybe the biggest single challenge to turning money into actual capability.
They definitely describe it as needing substantial and immediate enhancement, a major bottleneck. The sources point to systemic problems that have built up over decades. A key one is fragmentation. Instead of a truly integrated European or transatlantic defense market with standard parts, efficient cross-border production, you have this patchwork of national industries, different standards, different requirements, often duplicating effort. It makes large-scale, rapid production incredibly hard.
Especially for things needed quickly now.
Exactly. Ramping up capacity for drones, and especially ammunition, is seen as critical, urgent. But it's hampered by this fragmentation and also specific material shortages, like TNT for artillery shells. The sources note that caused delays in the EU's effort to get shells to Ukraine.
So are they suggesting ways to fix this industrial mess?
Yes. The sources mention needing innovative manufacturing, like exploring casting, instead of traditional forging for artillery rounds to speed things up. Critically, strengthening strategic supply chains, maybe even looking to partners like Japan for some components. And while Europe builds its own capacity, the sources stress the immediate need for transatlantic cooperation, especially with North America, to help refill depleted stocks and bridge production gaps now, while Europe's industry tries to get back on its feet.
Okay, so we've got the threat diagnosis, the ambitious money targets, the critical capabilities list, and a clear view of the industrial hurdles. But as you mentioned earlier, the sources are remarkably consistent in sounding a major alarm about the timeline. This seems key.
It really is the crux of the challenge in the material. The sources warn again and again. Even with the best intentions, the biggest budgets, money does not instantly equal military power. There's an unavoidable significant time lag. Budgets need approval, contracts signed, production lines scaled up, workers found, troops trained. Some estimates in the sources suggest that for complex rearmament across Europe, we could be looking at 5 to 10 years to see the full effect.
And that 5 to 10 year rearmament timeline is potentially much longer than the 2 to 5 year timeline the sources suggest for Russia's potential readiness to challenge NATO.
Precisely. This is where that race against the clock message, which is really prominent in the sources, becomes absolutely critical. The material emphasizes just boosting spending isn't enough. It won't automatically deliver the required capabilities or independence from the U.S. quickly enough to meet that projected threat window.
So what's the recommendation?
The sources strongly advocate for a highly strategic approach right now, a laser-like focus on identifying and prioritizing the most critical, most implementable capabilities, the ones that can actually be delivered and integrated within that urgent 2 to 3 year time frame to enhance deterrence and defense immediately, and tackling the industrial base issues, building cyber resilience that needs not just funding but urgent structural reforms, collaboration, which also takes time.
So we've seen the sources paint this picture. A clear, urgent threat from Russia rebuilding faster than expected, amplified by uncertainty over U.S. commitment, driving these huge spending target discussions up to 5% of GDP, aimed at specific capabilities like massive air defense, drone swarms, stronger forward presence, all while facing big hurdles in a fragmented industrial base and this really challenging timeline to deliver it all.
It's a high-stakes moment, no doubt. The sources are essentially flashing a yellow, maybe even a flashing red warning light. Europe is in a race to build up its defenses before that potential threat timeline arrives.
Which leaves us with this thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given these consistent warnings from the sources about how long it takes to turn spending into real capability, and that urgent 2 to 3 year timeline they mentioned for potential Russian readiness, what single most critical action do you think NATO and European nations should prioritize right now, starting today, to make the most significant, tangible difference to deterrence and defense within that very narrow window? Something to mull over.